the centuries roll backward. The empire breathes again. The wind sweeps across a vast plateau of volcanic rock and golden grass, carrying with it the faintest echo of chariot wheels and temple hymns. Behind these weathered cyclopean walls, beneath the shadow of the Lion Gate, where carved guardians still bare their teeth at the sky, a civilization once stood that rivaled Egypt itself for mastery of the ancient world. This is Hattusa, the fortress capital of the Hittite Empire, perched among craggy gorges in the heart of Anatolia. And for 3,000 years, the world forgot it ever existed. Before Rome carved its name into history, before Persia united the East, before classical Greece raised its marble columns, the Hittites commanded an empire stretching from the Aegean coast to the upper Euphrates. From this very citadel of Muwatalli, great kings dispatched armies that sacked Babylon, shattered the kingdom of Mitanni, and met the forces of Ramesses II on the plains of Kadesh in the largest chariot battle ever recorded. Their diplomats composed the oldest known peace treaty in human history, a document so remarkable that a replica of it hangs in the United Nations headquarters to this day. They mastered iron when the rest of the world still clung to bronze. They governed in multiple languages, worshipped 1,000 gods, and built temples whose foundations still mark the earth beneath our feet. And then they vanished. Around 1180 years before Christ, Hattusa burned. The great capital was abandoned. The archives fell silent. Dust covered the lion sculptures and the sacred rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya, where 63 deities once marched in carved procession across the living stone. It would take until the 20th century, until Hugo Winkler unearthed 10,000 cuneiform tablets from this very soil, for the world to remember what had been lost. This is the story we are about to tell, and we will tell it completely. We will journey from the very beginning, from the ancient Hatti people who first settled this plateau and buried their dead with golden sun disk standards at Alaka Hoyuk, through the arrival of Indo-European strangers who forged a kingdom from the wind-swept highlands. We will witness the empire's rise to power under conquerors like Suppiluliuma I, explore how ordinary Hittites lived and worked and prayed, understand the forces that brought this mighty civilization to its knees during the Bronze Age collapse, and follow the trail of its legacy through the Neo-Hittite kingdoms that preserved its traditions for 5 more centuries. We will stand beside the archaeologists who pulled this forgotten world back into the light. This is not simply a history lesson. This is a complete journey through time, from the first springs that watered this plateau to the museum halls in Ankara, where Hittite masterworks now rest behind glass. What unfolds in this story shaped the world we inhabit today. The concept of a binding treaty between equal powers, the spread of iron technology that transformed warfare and agriculture across entire continents, traditions of religious tolerance and legal restitution that echo through later civilizations. Some of the greatest turning points in human achievement are hidden in these stones, in these tablets, in the silence of this abandoned capital. By the end of this journey, you will understand not just what happened here, but how an entire civilization rose from obscurity, flourished with extraordinary sophistication, and then disappeared so completely that it became the greatest forgotten superpower of the ancient world. If you find yourself drawn to these complete journeys through lost civilizations, please subscribe so you do not miss our next exploration. Each week, we bring you the full story of a vanished world, told from the ground where it once stood. Now, let us begin our journey, here on this plateau where the wind still remembers the name of Hattusa. The wind moves across the central Anatolian plateau as it has for millennia, carrying the scent of dry sage and volcanic dust. The land stretches in every direction, a vast elevated steppe sitting more than 1,000 meters above the distant sea, ringed by mountain ranges whose peaks hold snow well into spring. Rivers have carved deep gorges through soft tufa and harder basalt, creating a landscape of sudden canyons and hidden valleys where water pools in unexpected abundance. This is a land of extremes, scorching summers that bake the earth to pale ochre, winters that bury entire settlements under heavy snow. And yet, long before any empire claimed this ground, people thrived here. The plateau owes its character to ancient volcanism. Erciyes and Hassan, two great volcanic peaks, once blanketed the region in ash and ignimbrite, creating a terrain of strange rock formations and fertile mineral-rich soils. The Kızılırmak, the longest river in Anatolia, bends in a great arc through the heart of this highland, enclosing within its curve a natural fortress of geography. The land inside that bend offers defensible terrain, reliable water, and access to trade routes running north toward the Black Sea coast and south through the Taurus mountain passes toward Mesopotamia and the Levant. Whoever controls this ground controls the crossroads of an entire continent. By roughly 2,500 years before the Common Era, a people known as the Hatti have established themselves across this plateau. They speak a language unrelated to any that will later dominate the region, not Semitic, not Indo-European, a tongue that scholars will eventually classify as a language isolate, preserved only in fragments within the ritual texts of their successors. The Hatti build settlements of mud brick on stone foundations, work copper and bronze with increasing sophistication, and develop a religious culture of profound complexity centered on earth deities, sacred springs, and the veneration of the dead. At Alaka Hoyuk, a site nestled in the rolling terrain north of the Kızılırmak Bend, royal tombs from around 2300 before the Common Era yield astonishing treasures. Bronze standards topped with stylized stags and bulls emerge from the earth alongside sun disk emblems, flat circular forms mounted on poles, their surfaces pierced with geometric patterns. Gold vessels, copper figurines inlaid with silver, and ceremonial weapons accompany the dead in stone-lined burial pits, roofed with timber and sealed with the skulls and hooves of sacrificed cattle. These are not the graves of simple chieftains. They belong to an elite ruling class presiding over a society with organized labor, specialized metalworkers, and elaborate funerary ritual. The pottery of this era carries a distinctive red burnished surface, polished to a warm glow that catches the light of the Anatolian sun. Vessels shaped as animals, bulls, lions, birds of prey, suggest a symbolic world rich with meaning, though the Hatti leave no written records of their own. Their legacy will survive only through the borrowed words, adopted gods, and absorbed traditions that a later civilization carries forward. Scattered across the plateau, other settlements rise at natural springs and river crossings. The land supports barley and emmer wheat in its lower valleys, while sheep and goat herds move across the upland pastures in seasonal rhythms that will persist for thousands of years. Obsidian from volcanic deposits provides sharp-edged tools and a valuable trade commodity. Copper ore, abundant in the northern mountains, feeds a growing metallurgical tradition. This is the world as it exists before the Great Change, before new languages echo across the plateau, before chariots roll through mountain passes, before a fortress city rises among the gorges and reaches for dominion over the known world. The Hatti tend their flocks, bury their kings with gold and bronze, and speak their prayers to gods of storm and spring. The plateau waits, ancient and patient, holding within its volcanic soil the foundations of an empire that does not yet have a name. Sometime around 2,000 years before the Common Era, new voices begin to carry across the Anatolian plateau. They come not as a sudden invasion, but as a slow, persistent infiltration, small groups filtering through the mountain passes of the Caucasus, or perhaps crossing from the Balkans through Thrace, moving in family bands with their livestock, their bronze tools, and a language unlike anything spoken in these highlands before. These are Indo-European speakers, and their words for water, for horse, for wheel share deep roots with tongues that will one day become Greek, Latin, Sanskrit. They settle among the Hatti, intermarrying, adopting local gods, absorbing customs, yet preserving the grammatical bones of their own speech. The process is gradual, measured in generations rather than battles. No single moment marks the transformation. The plateau simply changes, the way a river changes course, imperceptibly, then completely. But it is not these quiet newcomers who first bring writing to Anatolia. That distinction belongs to merchants from the city of Assur, far to the southeast on the banks of the Tigris. Around 1950 years before the Common Era, Assyrian traders establish a remarkable network of commercial colonies across central Anatolia, and the greatest of these rises at Kadesh, modern Kultepe, near the foot of Mount Erciyes. The Karum, the merchant quarter, spreads below the main settlement mound in a dense grid of mud brick houses, warehouses, and counting rooms. Narrow lanes wind between structures packed with sealed containers of tin and bolts of fine Mesopotamian textiles. Donkey caravans arrive after weeks on the road, having crossed the Taurus passes laden with tin from as far as Afghanistan and woven cloth from the workshops of Assur. They return carrying Anatolian silver and gold, the precious metals that fuel Mesopotamian economies. The merchants of Kadesh Karam Level 2 keep meticulous records. Thousands of cuneiform tablets, inscribed in Old Assyrian dialect and sealed inside clay envelopes stamped with cylinder seals, document every transaction, contracts, debt notes, shipping manifests, letters between business partners separated by hundreds of kilometers. These small clay rectangles represent the oldest written documents ever found in Anatolia. Among the Assyrian names in these records, other names appear, names that are neither Assyrian nor Hattic, but belong to the Indo-European newcomers who now hold positions of local authority. These are the earliest attested Hittite personal names, glimpsed only in the margins of someone else's accounting. The Karum system operates under formal agreements with local Anatolian rulers who grant trading privileges in exchange for taxes and gifts. The arrangement is sophisticated, governed by treaties that specify tariffs, resolve disputes, and regulate the movement of goods. Tin arrives in standardized ingots. Textiles are graded by quality. Silver is weighed against fixed standards. The entire network functions as one of antiquity's earliest international trade systems, linking the resources of the Anatolian highlands to the urban economies of Mesopotamia through a web of trust, credit, and contractual obligation. Around 1835 years before the Common Era, the Karum at Kadesh burns. It is rebuilt, Level 1B rises from the ashes, but the system never fully recovers its former scale. Local Anatolian powers are growing stronger, consolidating territory, competing with one another for control of trade routes and agricultural land. The Indo-European-speaking communities that arrived as scattered migrants are becoming organized polities, centered on fortified hilltop settlements, led by rulers who use Hittite names and worship a storm god they call by Hattic and Hurrian titles alike. The commercial infrastructure the Assyrians built has given these emerging kingdoms something invaluable. Not just access to tin and textiles, but exposure to the technology of writing, the concept of treaty law, and the administrative frameworks of organized states. The plateau is no longer waiting. It is preparing. Among the emerging hilltop polities of central Anatolia, one city commands attention not for its size or its wealth, but for its sheer defiance of geography. Hattusili sits at an elevation of over 1,000 meters, wedged between deep gorges carved by seasonal streams into the volcanic bedrock. The approach from the north drops sharply into ravines. The southern ridge rises toward a craggy summit, where wind scours the exposed rock face year-round. It is not an easy place to live. Winters are bitter. Water must be channeled carefully through the limestone, and the nearest fertile bottomland lies kilometers away. But it is an extraordinarily difficult place to attack, and in the volatile world of the 18th century before the Common Era, that quality matters more than comfort. The city has already existed for generations by this period, a modest but strategically vital settlement controlling the routes that connect the northern Pontic coast to the southern plains of Cappadocia. Merchants from the now diminished Assyrian trading network still pass through. Metalworkers still smelt copper in small furnaces along the lower slopes. But Hattusili is becoming something more than a waypoint. Its rulers are fortifying the citadel ridge known in later centuries as Muwatalli, raising walls of massive, roughly hewn stone blocks fitted without mortar in the Cyclopean style do enormous limestone boulders stacked with smaller stones wedged into the gaps, creating ramparts that seem to grow from the living rock itself. It is precisely this growing power that draws the wrath of Anita, king of Kusara, the most aggressive of the competing Anatolian warlords. Around 1750 years before the Common Era, Anita marches against Hattusili and takes it by storm. His victory inscription, preserved on a later cuneiform copy, records what follows with chilling precision. He destroys the city. He sows weeds upon its ground. And he pronounces a curse. Whoever among kings after him resettles Hattusili shall be struck by the storm god of heaven. The language is absolute. The intent is annihilation not merely of walls, but of the city's very right to exist. Yet the curse does not hold. Within a century, perhaps less, new builders return to the gorges. The defensive logic of the site proves irresistible. The deep ravines on three sides create natural moats no army can easily cross. The high southern ridge offers sight lines stretching across the plateau for dozens of kilometers. The springs that emerge from the limestone, while modest, provide reliable water even in drought years. Whoever these refounders are, and the historical record remains frustratingly silent on their precise identity. They begin the work of transforming Hattusa from a destroyed settlement into a fortified capital. New walls rise over the old destruction layers. The citadel of Muwatalli receives its first monumental gateway. Storage magazines are cut into the rock, designed to hold grain reserves sufficient for prolonged siege. The choice to defy Anita's curse carries theological weight. In a world where divine pronouncements shape political legitimacy, rebuilding a cursed city requires either extraordinary confidence or a deliberate claim to supersede the authority of the king who cursed it. The refounders of Hattusa are making a statement that echoes across the plateau, that this place belongs to them now, that the storm god's favor has shifted, that a new dynasty is rising from scorched earth. The landscape itself seems designed for this transformation. The gorges channel defenders naturally toward choke points. The rocky spurs provide elevated platforms for watchtowers. The terrain forces any attacking army to divide its forces and approach uphill through narrow defiles. By the mid-17th century, before the Common Era, the rebuilt city controls a territory large enough to project military power southward into the plains and northward toward the forested Pontic ranges. The foundations are being laid, literally, in Cyclopean stone, for what will become the seat of an empire. The curse of Anita has become the cornerstone of its rival's ambition. The man who transforms this fortress into the seat of a kingdom calls himself Hattusili, taking the city's own name as his royal identity. Around 1650 before the Common Era, he emerges as the first Hittite ruler whose deeds can be traced through his own words, a testament composed late in his reign, dictated to scribes who press reed styluses into wet clay. In this document, he describes himself not as a conqueror born to power, but as a king forged by war, a man who crossed mountains and rivers to carry Hittite authority into lands that had never heard the name of Hattusa. The Lion Gate stands as the architectural signature of this ambition. Two massive stone lions flank the southwestern entrance to the city, their muscular bodies carved from single blocks of limestone, their open jaws frozen in perpetual warning. The craftsmanship is deliberate and bold. These are not decorative flourishes, but declarations of sovereign power, visible to every merchant, diplomat, and soldier who approaches the capital. The lions face outward, guardians of a threshold between the highland stronghold and the wider world that Hattusili intends to claim. His campaigns begin with the subjugation of neighboring Anatolian kingdoms, consolidating control over the plateau before turning south toward the rich cities of northern Syria. The prize is Aleppo, seat of the powerful Hittite Kingdom, a center of trade connecting Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean coast. Hattusili strikes repeatedly through the 1640s before the Common Era, pushing through the Taurus mountain passes with armies equipped with bronze-tipped spears, curved sickle swords, and lightweight chariots drawn by trained horses. The campaigns are grueling. Hattusili himself suffers serious illness or injury during the Syrian wars, and his testament reveals a reign troubled by betrayal within his own family, nephews and adopted heirs who conspire against him, who are stripped of succession one by one. Yet the military momentum he establishes proves irreversible. Before his death, Hattusili designates his grandson Mursili as heir, a young man who will inherit both the throne and his grandfather's unfinished war against Aleppo. Mursili completes the conquest, shattering the Yamhad kingdom and absorbing its territories into the Hittite sphere. But what follows defies all expectation. Rather than consolidating these Syrian gains, Muwatalli turns his army eastward and marches deep into Mesopotamia itself. The distance is staggering. From Hattusa to Babylon stretches more than 1,200 kilometers of river valleys, arid steppe, and hostile territory. Around 1595, before the Common Era, Muwatalli's forces descend along the Euphrates and fall upon Babylon, the greatest city in the ancient world, seat of the dynasty that Hammurabi had founded nearly 2 centuries earlier. The Hittite army breaches the walls, plunders the temples, and carries away the sacred statue of the god Marduk. The old Babylonian dynasty collapses. A political order that had shaped Mesopotamian civilization for generations ends in a single campaign season. Bronze weaponry recovered from contemporary Hittite contexts reveals the tools of this conquest: leaf-shaped spearheads, flanged axes designed to penetrate armor, and daggers with crescent-shaped pommels. The chariots of this period are light, 2-wheeled vehicles crewed by a driver and a warrior, fast enough to exploit breaches in enemy formations and mobile enough to navigate the varied terrain between Anatolia and the Euphrates plain. The sack of Babylon resonates across the entire Near East, announcing the Hittites as a power capable of projecting force far beyond their highland homeland. Yet Muwatalli does not attempt to hold Mesopotamia. The army withdraws northward, laden with spoils, leaving a power vacuum that the Kassites will eventually fill. The campaign's purpose appears to have been punitive and symbolic rather than territorial, a demonstration that the king of Hattusa can reach any throne, topple any dynasty, and return to his mountain fortress unchallenged. The lions at the gate now guard an empire whose roar has been heard from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. But the roar fades into silence with terrifying speed. Muwatalli I returns from Babylon to a court seething with conspiracy, and within months of his triumph, he is dead, murdered by his own brother-in-law Hattusili and a courtier named Zidanta. The assassination takes place within the innermost chambers of Muwatalli, the fortified citadel perched on the highest rock outcrop above Hattusa, where narrow corridors and windowless storage rooms make privacy indistinguishable from vulnerability. The king who toppled Babylon's dynasty cannot survive the politics of his own household. Hattusili seizes the throne, but the blood he has spilled does not purchase stability. It purchases a precedent. The decades that follow descend into a pattern so repetitive it reads less like history than like ritual. Hattusili's own sons are murdered. Zidanta, his co-conspirator, eventually turns against him and claims the kingship for himself. Zidanta's son Amuna then kills his own father to take the throne. Each succession is a knife in the dark, each reign haunted by the violence of its beginning. The cuneiform records from this period, fragmentary and stained with the bureaucratic language of later scribes attempting to reconstruct what happened, convey a court where no king trusts his own family and no prince survives long enough to establish legitimacy. The empire contracts. Territories won by Hattusili and Muwatalli slip away. The cities of northern Syria reassert their independence. The Kaska peoples to the north press against Hittite borders with increasing boldness. Without stable leadership, the military apparatus that projected power to the Euphrates cannot maintain its reach. The great stone walls of Hattusa still stand, but the authority they symbolize erodes from within. It is against this backdrop of generational fratricide that a king named Telepinu comes to power around 1500 before the Common Era. His own accession is not free of violence. He deposes his predecessor, but what distinguishes Telepinu from his blood-soaked predecessors is what he does once seated on the throne. He composes a text that later scholars will call the Edict of Telepinu, and it represents nothing less than an attempt to break the cycle of murder that has consumed the Hittite monarchy for nearly a century. The edict, preserved on cuneiform tablets recovered from the archives of Muwatalli, begins with a historical prologue recounting the assassinations in unflinching detail. Telepinu names the killers and their victims, tracing the chain of bloodshed from Hattusili forward, making the dysfunction visible and undeniable. Then he establishes a rule: succession shall follow the line of the firstborn son. If no son of the first rank exists, a son of the second rank shall inherit. If no son at all survives, then a daughter's husband may take the throne. The sequence is fixed, the ambiguity that invited murder eliminated. But Telepinu goes further. He establishes or formalizes the Pancus, an assembly of nobles and dignitaries empowered to serve as a judicial body. No king may arbitrarily execute members of the royal family. Disputes over succession are to be adjudicated, not resolved by assassination. The Pancus functions as a constitutional check on royal violence, a mechanism almost without parallel in the ancient Near East at this date. Seal impressions from Telepinu's reign, pressed into clay bullae that once secured documents and containers, show the royal name rendered in careful cuneiform, artifacts of a king determined to leave his mark through law rather than conquest. The edict does not end the political tensions within the Hittite court, but it provides a framework, a reference point to which future kings will appeal when justifying their own claims. It transforms the monarchy from a prize seized by the strongest hand into an institution governed, at least in theory, by predictable rules. The plateau endures its harsh winters. Snow settles on the Cyclopean walls and fills the gorges below the citadel. But within those walls, something has shifted. The kingdom that nearly destroyed itself through unchecked ambition now possesses a written constitution for survival, inscribed in clay and stored in the same archives that hold treaties and temple inventories. The Hittite state, battered and diminished, has chosen to bind its own power with words, and in doing so has laid the foundation upon which a future empire will rise. The century that follows Telepinu's edict is among the most obscure in Hittite history. The cuneiform record thins to near silence, and the names of kings blur into uncertain sequences that modern scholars struggle to reconstruct. Yet the kingdom persists. The plateau still yields its barley harvests, the forges still glow with bronze, and the walls of Hattusa still stand against the wind. What changes is the world beyond those walls. From the mountainous north, a people known as the Kaska begin pressing against the empire's most vulnerable frontier. They are not a unified kingdom, but a loose confederation of hill-dwelling communities, pastoral and fierce, occupying the densely forested slopes between the plateau and the Black Sea coast. They raid in sudden strikes, burning frontier towns and retreating into terrain where chariots cannot follow. The Kaska become a chronic wound that no Hittite king fully heals, a pressure that drains military resources generation after generation. Their settlements cling to ridgelines and narrow valleys, timber-built and impermanent, leaving scant archaeological traces but enormous strategic consequences. To the southeast, a far more sophisticated threat takes shape. The Hurrian people, long present across Upper Mesopotamia and northern Syria, coalesce under the dynasty of Mitanni into a powerful kingdom stretching from the Kabur River Triangle to the Mediterranean coast. Mitanni's kings command their own chariot aristocracy, the Merianu, and their cultural influence radiates outward through religion, literature, and diplomatic marriage. Hurrian deities, Hurrian ritual practices, and the Hurrian language itself begin filtering into Hittite religious life, a slow absorption that will eventually reshape the pantheon of Hattusa. But politically, Mitanni stands as a direct rival for control of the Syrian vassal states that provide access to trade routes, tin, and the wealth of the ancient Near East. Between the Casca raids and Mitanni's dominance over Syria, the Hittite Middle Kingdom contracts. Vassal states drift from allegiance. The Western territories face pressure from the kingdoms of Arzawa. For decades, the empire seems caught in a slow retreat, its energies consumed by defense rather than expansion. Then, sometime around 1430 before the Common Era, a king named Tudaliya ascends the throne, and the trajectory reverses. The sources remain fragmentary, but the pattern of his reign is unmistakable. Tudaliya launches campaigns on multiple fronts with a strategic ambition not seen since the days of Hattusili I. He strikes westward against Arzawa, reasserting Hittite authority over lands that had slipped away. He campaigns in the north against the Casca, pushing them back from the immediate approaches to the capital. And critically, he turns his attention towards the southeast, challenging Mitanni's grip on the territories that once acknowledged Hittite supremacy. The walls of Hattusa expand during this era. New fortification circuits rise in the upper city, enclosing temple precincts and administrative quarters that speak to a state growing in confidence and organizational complexity. The city's footprint swells to nearly 180 hectares, making it one of the largest settlements in the ancient Near East. Massive limestone blocks are fitted into defensive circuits that follow the natural contours of the ridgeline, incorporating towers at regular intervals and the sophisticated gate complexes that will become hallmarks of Hittite military architecture. Diplomatic correspondence begins to flow with greater frequency. Clay tablets in Akkadian, the lingua franca of international relations, carry messages between Hattusa and the courts of Babylon, Egypt, and the Syrian city-states. The Hittite Kingdom is re-entering the network of great power diplomacy, asserting its right to be addressed as an equal. Tudaliya does not complete the transformation. The empire he leaves behind remains embattled, its northern frontier still bleeding, its hold on Syria still contested. But he establishes the template that his successors will follow: aggressive military campaigning combined with diplomatic engagement and monumental building. The machinery of imperial expansion has been set in motion. Within 2 generations, a king will arise who carries this momentum to its ultimate expression, shattering Mitanni entirely and remaking the political map of the ancient world. The plateau that endured a century of silence is stirring again, and the sound that rises from its forges and its garrison towns is the deep gathering rumble of an empire preparing to be reborn. Anuwanda I inherits a kingdom already straining at its seams. The campaigns of Tudaliya have pushed the boundaries of Hittite ambition outward, but the sinews of empire cannot hold what conquest has claimed. Along the northern frontier, the Casca tribes remain unbroken, their raids growing bolder with each passing season. Smoke rises from burned granaries in the Pontic foothills, and garrison towns that once anchored Hittite authority stand half abandoned, their mud-brick walls crumbling under neglect and assault. Arnuwanda's own texts betray a tone not of triumph but of grievance, cataloguing the territories lost, the cult images stolen, the priests carried off into captivity by raiders who recognize no treaty and honor no border. The scale of the crisis becomes visible in the landscape itself. Charred settlement layers across the northern provinces mark a systematic unraveling. The Casca do not seek to conquer in any imperial sense. They burn, they plunder, they withdraw into forested highlands where Hittite chariots cannot follow. But their cumulative effect is devastating. Entire districts that once supplied grain and conscripts to the royal army fall silent. Tax revenues collapse. The network of roads and way stations that connected Hattusa to its provinces frays at its edges, and the Casca are not alone. To the west, the kingdom of Arzawa senses weakness and begins asserting independence with increasing boldness, establishing diplomatic contact with Egypt and positioning itself as a rival power in western Anatolia. To the southeast, Hurrian-influenced territories waver in their loyalty. The empire that Tudalia began to build finds itself besieged from nearly every direction simultaneously, a concentric pressure that no single campaign can relieve. Under Tudalia III, the situation deteriorates to its most desperate point. The sources speak of enemies reaching the very approaches of Hattusa itself. The sacred capital, protected by its gorges and its massive fortification walls, faces the unthinkable prospect of direct assault. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals hasty reinforcements to defensive structures, walls thickened and gates narrowed, the architecture of a city preparing not for glory but for survival. The upper city's temples, repositories of divine favor and state legitimacy, stand vulnerable for the first time in generations. This is the Nada, the Hittite state, barely a century removed from the stabilizing reforms of Telepinu's edict, teeters on the edge of dissolution. Vassal kingdoms that once sent tribute and troops now calculate whether the great king in Hattusa can still protect them, and many conclude he cannot. The diplomatic correspondence of the period reveals a court increasingly isolated, its claims to great kingship ringing hollow against the reality of shrinking borders and unanswered raids. Yet the empire does not fall. Something in the political culture forged by generations of crisis, the institutional memory of survival, the religious conviction that the storm god has chosen Hattusa as his seat, holds the center together. Tudalia III fights a grinding defensive war, stabilizing what can be stabilized, accepting losses where he must. He gathers around him a cadre of military commanders hardened by constant warfare, men who understand that the empire's survival depends not on a single decisive battle, but on the relentless, unglamorous work of holding ground. Among these commanders stands a young prince whose abilities are already becoming apparent. The son of Tudalia, or perhaps his son-in-law, the sources remain ambiguous. This figure distinguishes himself in the desperate campaigns of the 1380s and 1370s before the Common Era. He learns warfare not in the expansive confidence of imperial conquest, but in the bitter school of near annihilation, fighting to preserve what remains rather than to seize what beckons. The lessons shape a strategic mind of extraordinary ruthlessness and patience. The crisis forges the instrument of its own resolution, The very desperation that nearly destroys the Hittite state produces a generation of leaders who understand power with a clarity that prosperity never demands. The burned villages and lost provinces become not merely wounds, but education, a comprehensive map of every vulnerability that must be addressed before the empire can reach outward again. In the flickering firelight of besieged Hattusa, in the war councils held within the thick-walled chambers of Muwatalli, the blueprint for imperial revival takes shape. The prince who will become Suppiluliuma watches, learns, and waits. The empire's darkest hour is already kindling the flame of its greatest reign. Suppiluliuma seizes the throne around 1350 before the Common Era, and the transformation is immediate. The cautious defensive posture that has defined Hittite strategy for generations gives way to a calculated aggression that will redraw the political map of the entire ancient Near East. The new great king understands that survival alone is no longer sufficient. The Hittite state must dominate or be consumed. His first campaigns are methodical. The Casca raiders who have terrorized the northern frontier for decades are driven back into their mountain strongholds, not destroyed but neutralized, their capacity for large-scale incursion broken by a series of swift, punitive strikes. The western borders are stabilized through a combination of military force and vassal treaties that bind local rulers to Hattusa with oaths sworn before the 1,000 gods. Each campaign is preparation, each treaty a freed hand, every pacified frontier another division available for the great enterprise that consumes Suppiluliuma's strategic vision, the destruction of Mitanni. The Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni has been the dominant power in Upper Mesopotamia and northern Syria for over a century, its capital Washukani commanding the rich agricultural lands between the Tigris and Euphrates headwaters. Its network of vassal states stretches from the Mediterranean coast to the Assyrian heartland. For generations, Mitanni has blocked Hittite expansion southward, and its alliance with Egypt has made it seem unassailable. But Suppiluliuma perceives what others do not. Mitanni is fracturing from within. Succession disputes have weakened the royal house. The Assyrians under Ashurbanipal I are pressing from the east, eager to throw off Mitanni's overlordship. Egypt under Akhenaten has turned inward, consumed by religious revolution, its diplomatic attention scattered and its military commitments unreliable. The Hittite king strikes around 1340 before the Common Era with devastating precision. His armies cross the Euphrates and drive deep into Mitanni's heartland. The vassal kingdoms of northern Syria, Aleppo, Mukish, Nia, Katna, fall in rapid succession, their rulers either submitting to Hittite authority or fleeing. The great fortress city of Carchemish, commanding the primary Euphrates crossing point, is besieged and taken. Suppiluliuma installs his sons as viceroys in the conquered territories, Piasili at Carchemish and Telepinu at Aleppo, creating a dynastic network that binds Syria directly to the Hittite royal house. Mitanni collapses as a great power. Its king Tushratta is murdered by his own son, and the remnant state becomes a contested buffer between Hatti and a resurgent Assyria. The geopolitical order that has governed the Near East for over a century dissolves in a single generation. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt millennia later, preserve the desperate correspondence of Syrian vassals begging their Egyptian overlord for help that never arrives. The clay tablets, inscribed in Akkadian diplomatic script, reveal a world in upheaval with Suppiluliuma's shadow falling across every court from the Orontes to the Nile. Then comes the most extraordinary episode in all of Bronze Age diplomacy. Around 1323 before the Common Era, an Egyptian queen, almost certainly the widow of Tutankhamun, sends an unprecedented letter to Suppiluliuma, requesting a Hittite prince as her husband and future pharaoh. The Hittite king is stunned. Nothing in the annals of Near Eastern diplomacy has precedent for such a request. After months of suspicious verification, he sends his son Zananza southward toward Egypt. The prince never arrives. He is murdered on the journey, almost certainly by forces loyal to the Egyptian general Horemheb, who will seize the throne himself. Suppiluliuma's rage is terrible. He launches retaliatory raids into Egyptian-held territory in southern Syria, and his troops bring back prisoners. Among those captives travels something invisible and catastrophic, a plague that will devastate Hatti for 20 years. The conqueror who has reshaped the world succumbs to this pestilence around 1322 before the Common Era, dying at the height of his power, his empire stretching from the Aegean to the Euphrates, his dynasty installed across Syria, his name feared in every palace from Babylon to Thebes. The plague-bearing prisoners from Egypt become the bitter final irony of a reign defined by triumph, the conquered land delivering its most lethal counterattack, not through armies, but through invisible contagion carried home in the blood of captives. The plague does not relent. It moves through the royal household with methodical cruelty, claiming Suppiluliuma's eldest surviving son Arnuwanda II within months of his accession. The young king barely has time to assume the throne before the same invisible pestilence that consumed his father drags him into darkness, leaving behind no great deeds, no campaigns, no legacy, except a name on a king list and an empire reeling from successive losses at its very summit. The crown passes to Muwatalli II, a younger son who ascends around 1321 before the Common Era as little more than a youth. The courts of rival kingdoms watch with predatory attention. A boy king ruling a plague-ravaged empire seems like an invitation to rebellion, and the invitation is accepted across every frontier simultaneously. The Casca raiders descend from their northern highlands with renewed ferocity. The western Anatolian kingdom of Arzawa, long a restive vassal, declares open independence and begins absorbing neighboring territories. In Syria, the carefully constructed network of client states installed by Suppiluliuma trembles as local rulers test the resolve of this untried monarch. What they discover is steel beneath the youth. Muwatalli II proves to be among the most capable military commanders in Hittite history, launching systematic campaigns that methodically restore every lost frontier. Around 1318 before the Common Era, he turns his full attention westward against Arzawa, marching his forces across the rugged interior of Anatolia toward the Aegean coast. The Arzawan king Uhaziti flees before the advancing Hittite army, and the kingdom shatters into smaller vassal states that Muwatalli reorganizes under loyal governors. The western frontier, unstable for generations, is brought firmly under Hittite control. Yet even as his armies triumph, the plague continues its relentless harvest among the population. The death toll across 2 decades is staggering, thinning the ranks of soldiers, farmers, and priests alike. It is in this crucible of suffering that Muwatalli composes the most extraordinary documents to survive from the ancient Near East, the Plague Prayers. Pressed into clay tablets in the cuneiform script, these texts represent something unprecedented. A king standing before the gods not in triumph, but in anguished supplication, confessing the sins of his father's generation and begging for divine mercy. The prayers acknowledge that Suppiluliuma violated sacred treaties, and that the plague is divine punishment for these transgressions. The theological sophistication is remarkable, a concept of inherited guilt, of cosmic justice operating across generations, articulated with raw emotional power. During his reign, scribes record a celestial omen of extraordinary significance. The sun god displays a sign in the heavens, likely a solar eclipse, interpreted as a divine message requiring careful ritual response. The event underscores the intimate connection between cosmic phenomena and royal legitimacy in Hittite thought. Muwatalli campaigns relentlessly for over 25 years, crushing the Kaska in the north, securing the Syrian vassals, and extending Hittite influence deeper into western Anatolia than any predecessor. He installs his sons as regional viceroys, Muwatalli in a position of growing authority, Hattusili as a military commander in the northern provinces, creating an administrative structure designed to hold the vast empire together through trusted family governance. The cuneiform archives from his reign are among the richest in Hittite history, revealing not only military annals but detailed ritual texts, diplomatic correspondence, and administrative records that illuminate the full machinery of imperial power. By the time Muwatalli II passes the throne to his son Muwatalli, around 1295 before the Common Era, the empire has not merely survived its darkest trial, it has emerged consolidated, battle-hardened, and administratively more sophisticated than before. The plague has finally subsided. The frontiers hold, the vassal network functions, and the stage is set for the next generation to confront the rising power of Egypt's 19th dynasty along the contested borderlands of Syria, where the Orontes River flows through a valley that will soon witness the greatest chariot battle the ancient world has ever known. Muwatalli II ascends to the throne of a restored empire, but he inherits a confrontation that has been building for decades. Egypt's 19th dynasty, founded by military men from the eastern delta, has turned its gaze northward with renewed aggression. Seti I has already marched through the Bekaa Valley and briefly seized the fortress city of Kadesh on the Orontes, planting Egyptian authority in territory the Hittites consider firmly within their sphere. The message is unmistakable. Egypt intends to reclaim the Syrian lands it once dominated under the great pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, and the buffer of vassal kingdoms that Suppiluliuma so carefully constructed now stands directly in the path of Egyptian ambition. Muwatalli responds with a decision that shocks the empire. He relocates the royal court and the primary seat of government southward to Tarhuntassa, a city in the rugged Hulaya riverland of southern Anatolia. The sacred capital of Hattusa remains a religious center, entrusted to his brother Hattusili as governor of the upper land, but the political heart of the kingdom shifts dramatically closer to the Syrian frontier. The move is strategic and deliberate. Tarhuntassa places the king nearer to the contested territories where the decisive struggle will unfold, shortening communication lines and allowing faster mobilization of southern vassal forces. In the workshops of Hittite garrison towns, the preparations for war take physical form. Bronze arrowheads are cast by the thousands in stone molds, their tanged bases designed for deep penetration through leather armor. Chariot frames of bent wood and leather are assembled with meticulous care, each vehicle built to carry 3 men, a driver, a shield-bearer, and a warrior armed with a thrusting spear. This 3-man configuration gives the Hittite chariot a decisive advantage in close combat, transforming it from a mobile archery platform into a shock weapon capable of breaking enemy formations on impact. Muwatalli's diplomatic machinery operates with equal intensity. Messengers carry sealed tablets across vast distances, summoning contingents from every corner of the empire and beyond. The vassal kingdoms of Ugarit, Kizzuwatna, Aleppo, and Carchemish receive their orders. Allies from as far as western Anatolia and the lands along the Euphrates pledge their chariots and infantry. The coalition that assembles is staggering in scale. Later Egyptian accounts will claim the Hittite force numbers nearly 50,000 men and 3,500 chariots drawn from some 16 allied and vassal states. Meanwhile, the young pharaoh Ramesses II, barely into his 20s, marshals his own forces at the frontier fortress of Charu in the eastern delta. 4 divisions named for the gods Amun, Re, Ptah, and Seth begin the long march northward through Canaan, following the coastal road before turning inland toward the Orontes Valley. Egyptian intelligence reports suggest Kadesh is lightly defended. The Hittite army, according to captured informants, remains far to the north near Aleppo. The information is catastrophically wrong. Muwatalli has concealed his entire force behind the city of Kadesh itself, using the ancient tell and the surrounding terrain to mask the largest chariot army ever assembled in the Bronze Age world. The Orontes River curves around the western side of the city, and the tributary Muwatalli stream creates a natural screen to the south. In this landscape of river bends and low ridges, tens of thousands of men and horses wait in disciplined silence. The road to Kadesh narrows through the Bekaa Valley, flanked by the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountain ranges. Spring wildflowers carpet the valley floor, and the Orontes glitters under a pale Syrian sky. It is the spring of 1274 before the Common Era. The Egyptian divisions advance in a long, strung-out column, separated by miles of open road, each division unaware of the trap that awaits. Ramesses and the Amun division press ahead, eager to establish camp on the plain northwest of Kadesh before the other divisions arrive. The distance between the leading and trailing Egyptian formations grows dangerously wide. Muwatalli watches from the heights east of the city. His chariot commanders have their orders. The timing must be precise. Strike the column while it is divided, before the Egyptian divisions can consolidate. The Hittite king has spent years preparing for this single moment, assembling the greatest military coalition the ancient Near East has ever seen, relocating his own capital to be closer to the battlefield, and now positioning his forces with a patience and tactical sophistication that will echo through 3 millennia of military history. The chariots stand ready, their bronze fittings catching the afternoon light, their horses stamping in the dust of the Orontes plain. The signal comes in the early afternoon. 2,500 Hittite chariots surge from concealment east of the Orontes, fording the river at a shallow crossing south of Kadesh, where the water barely reaches the axles. Each chariot carries 3 men, a driver gripping leather reins, a shield-bearer crouching behind a tall rectangular shield, and a warrior armed with a javelin or lance. This 3-man configuration is heavier than the Egyptian 2-man design, slower in open pursuit, but devastating in the initial shock of impact. The chariots cross the river in disciplined formations, and slam into the marching column of the Egyptian Re division as it stretches across the plain, still kilometers south of the royal encampment where Ramesses has made camp with the Amun division. The Re division shatters. Soldiers scatter across the dry grassland, abandoning equipment, breaking formation entirely. The Hittite chariots do not pause. They wheel northward, driving fleeing Egyptian troops before them like chaff, and within the hour they reach the camp of the Amun division itself. The perimeter of the Egyptian encampment, a rectangle of shields and ox carts, buckles under the weight of the assault. Hittite chariots pour through gaps in the makeshift barricade. The camp dissolves into chaos, with pack animals stampeding, supply wagons overturned, and Egyptian infantry fighting in isolated clusters without cohesion or command. Ramesses, according to his own later inscriptions carved at Luxor and Abu Simbel, finds himself nearly surrounded, cut off with only his household guard and a handful of chariots. The Egyptian accounts describe a desperate counterattack led by the pharaoh personally, though the Hittite records make no mention of such heroics. What both sides confirm is that the battle reaches a moment of extreme crisis for Egypt. The Amun division is on the verge of annihilation, and the two remaining Egyptian divisions, the Ptah and the Sutek, are still hours away on the march road. Then the balance shifts. A force of elite troops known as the Nearin, possibly a detached Egyptian contingent that had traveled separately along the coastal route through Amuru, arrives from the west and strikes the Hittite chariots in the flank. The timing is either extraordinary luck or the result of prior coordination that the surviving records do not fully explain. The Hittite chariot crews, many of whom have dismounted to loot the Egyptian camp, are caught exposed and disorganized. The Nearin attack forces them back towards the river. Muwatalli still holds his reserve, a substantial infantry force and additional chariots positioned on the east bank, but he does not commit them. The reasons remain debated across millennia of military analysis. Perhaps the terrain near the river crossing limits the deployment of massed chariots. Perhaps the arrival of the Egyptian Ptah division from the south, finally reaching the battlefield in the late afternoon, convinces the Hittite king that a decisive breakthrough is no longer possible without unacceptable losses. By evening, the fighting subsides. The plain between the Orontes and the Egyptian camp is strewn with broken chariots, dead horses, and fallen soldiers from a dozen kingdoms. Hittite casualties include men from Azawa, Lucca, Kidzuatna, Ugarit, and Kadesh itself, the full breadth of the coalition Muwatalli has assembled. Egyptian losses among the Re and Amun divisions are severe. Neither army advances the following day. No fortress changes hands, no king is captured or killed. Ramesses withdraws southward toward Egyptian territory. Muwatalli retains control of Kadesh and reasserts Hittite authority over the contested region of Amuru. In strategic terms, the Hittite position in Syria remains intact, and the Egyptian advance is halted. Yet Ramesses commissions the most extensive battle narrative in ancient history, carved on temple walls across Egypt, declaring total victory. The Hittite archives at Hattusa preserve a different accounting, one of successful defense and Egyptian retreat. Both empires claim triumph. Both are partially correct. The battle proves that neither superpower can destroy the other, that the cost of continued war exceeds any possible territorial gain. This realization, born in the dust and blood of the Orontes plain, will take 15 more years to mature into formal acknowledgement. But the seed is planted here, on a single afternoon when the two greatest military powers of the Bronze Age fight each other to exhaustion and discover the limits of conquest. The 15 years that follow Kadesh are years of slow, grinding recognition. Muwatalli II dies around 1267 before the Common Era, and the succession fractures immediately. His son Urhi-Teshub takes the throne as Mursili III, but he is young, inexperienced, and politically isolated. His uncle Hattusili, the younger brother of Muwatalli, has spent decades commanding armies in the north, holding the Kaska frontier, governing the holy city of Nerik. He is battle-hardened, politically shrewd, and deeply connected to the priesthood through his wife Puduhepa, a priestess of the goddess Ishtar at Lawazantia. For 7 years, the tension between uncle and nephew builds. Urhi-Teshub attempts to strip Hattusili of his northern territories. Hattusili endures, retreats, calculates. Then, around 1260 before the Common Era, he strikes. The coup is swift. Urhi-Teshub is deposed and sent into exile, first within Hittite territory, then eventually to Egypt itself, where he becomes a perpetual diplomatic irritant between the two courts. Hattusili III knows that seizing the throne from a legitimate king demands justification. He composes a remarkable document known today as the Apology of Hattusili, a carefully constructed narrative arguing that divine will ordained his kingship. It is among the earliest political autobiographies in human history, a text that blends personal testimony with theological argument, presenting the coup not as ambition but as sacred destiny. Yet Hattusili's most enduring achievement lies not in how he took power, but in what he does with it. The Assyrian Empire under Shalmaneser I is expanding aggressively from the east, absorbing former Mitanni territories and pressing against Hittite vassal states along the upper Euphrates. The strategic calculus has shifted. Egypt is no longer the primary threat. Assyria is. Around 1259 before the Common Era, Hattusili and Ramesses II conclude a formal peace treaty. The original Hittite version is inscribed on a silver tablet, now lost to history but described in the cuneiform copies found at Hattusa. The Egyptian version survives carved in hieroglyphs on the walls of the temple at Karnak and the Ramesseum at Thebes. Both versions establish mutual non-aggression, pledge military assistance if either party is attacked by a third power, and include detailed extradition clauses for political refugees, a pointed provision given Urhi-Teshub's presence in Egypt. The treaty addresses the two kings as equals. The phrasing is deliberate, reciprocal, unprecedented in its symmetry. Each ruler acknowledges the other as great king. Each pledges that the agreement binds not only themselves, but their descendants. The gods of both lands are invoked as witnesses, 1,000 deities of Hatti alongside the gods of Egypt, and curses are pronounced upon whoever breaks the terms. Queen Puduhepa plays a role rarely visible in Bronze Age diplomacy. She corresponds directly with Ramesses, her seal appearing on official letters, her authority recognized by the Egyptian court. She negotiates the terms of a diplomatic marriage that will cement the alliance. Around 1246 before the Common Era, a Hittite princess journeys south to Egypt with a vast dowry. Ramesses records the event on monumental stelae, describing the princess's beauty and the wealth that accompanies her. She is given an Egyptian name and enters the royal household. The peace holds. For the remaining decades of both kingdoms' existence, no Hittite and Egyptian armies meet in battle. Trade flows between the two courts. Letters exchange pleasantries, medical advice, requests for skilled craftsmen. The diplomatic correspondence reveals a relationship that evolves from wary formality into something approaching genuine alliance. A replica of this treaty hangs today in the headquarters of the United Nations in New York, a recognition that the principles articulated on that lost silver tablet, mutual recognition, collective security, the peaceful resolution of disputes between sovereign powers, remain foundational to international law more than 3,000 years after they were first pressed into metal by Hittite scribes working in the archive rooms of Hattusa. But the treaty's silver tablet is only one artifact of a civilization that, during these same decades of diplomatic triumph, is building something extraordinary in stone. Hattusa, at its imperial zenith, is not merely a political capital. It is a sacred landscape, a city designed as much for the gods as for the mortals who serve them. The lower city spreads across a gentle slope where the great temple rises, the largest religious structure in the entire Hittite world. Temple 1, dedicated jointly to the storm god of Hatti and the sun goddess of Arinna, occupies a precinct measuring roughly 160 meters by 135 meters. Massive limestone blocks, some weighing many tons, form its foundations. The temple complex is not a single building, but an entire district unto itself. Storerooms, administrative quarters, workshops, and ritual chambers organized around a central courtyard paved with fitted stone. Within those storerooms stand enormous clay storage vessels, pithoi taller than a man, their bellies holding grain, oil, and wine dedicated to the divine household. The gods of Hatti do not merely receive prayer. They receive sustenance, clothing, entertainment. They are treated as living residents of the city, and their temple functions as a palace in its own right. The approach to the inner sanctum passes through a sequence of gateways designed to separate the profane from the sacred with increasing intensity. The cult chambers themselves are modest in size, intimate spaces where cult statues of the storm god and sun goddess stand in dim light, attended by priests who wash, dress, and feed the divine images according to strict ritual calendars. Green diorite and basalt fragments found in the ruins suggest the statues possessed a solemn weight, carved from the hardest stones the Anatolian earth could yield. Above the lower city, the upper city climbs southward across a series of ridges, and here the scale of Hittite devotion becomes staggering. 31 temples have been identified in this elevated precinct, constructed primarily during the 13th century before the Common Era. Each temple follows a broadly similar plan: a courtyard, a sequence of rooms, a cult chamber, yet each serves different deities drawn from the vast Hittite pantheon. The upper city is a theological encyclopedia rendered in architecture, a district where Hattic, Hurrian, Luwian, and Mesopotamian divinities coexist in stone proximity. Northeast of the city walls, cut into a natural limestone outcrop, lies Yazilikaya, the most visually arresting sacred site in the Hittite world. 2 roofless chambers carved into living rock serve as an open-air sanctuary. Chamber A, the larger gallery, displays a procession of 63 deities carved in low relief along its walls. Male gods march from the left, female goddesses from the right, converging at the rear wall where the storm god Teshub and the goddess Hepat meet in divine union. Teshub stands upon 2 mountain gods rendered as human figures, wearing a horned cap, carrying a mace. Hepat stands upon a panther, their son Sharuma behind her upon a smaller panther. The carving is precise, deliberate. each deity identifiable by attributes, animal pedestals, and hieroglyphic labels. Chamber B is smaller, narrower, more secretive. 12 identical gods march along one wall, rendered as sword deities, their blades forming their bodies, lion heads crowning the hilts. The god Nergal, lord of the underworld, dominates the opposite wall as a massive sword driven into the earth, its hilt formed by 4 lions. A carved relief of King Tudaliya IV appears in the protective embrace of Sharuma, the divine prince guiding the mortal king. This chamber almost certainly served a funerary purpose, a place where the soul of the dead king entered the company of chthonic powers. The sanctuary at Yazilikaya functions as a cosmological map. The procession in Chamber A mirrors the great spring festival, the Anta Shum, when the gods assembled in divine congress. The reliefs freeze that cosmic gathering permanently in stone, ensuring the ritual order of the universe endures beyond any single ceremony. The orientation of the chambers aligns with astronomical events, the play of sunlight at specific seasons illuminating particular figures at precise moments. Together, Temple 1 and Yazilikaya reveal a civilization that understood sacred space as technology, architecture engineered to maintain the relationship between heaven, earth, and the underworld. Every carved figure, every foundation stone, every storage jar of consecrated grain serves a single purpose: keeping the 1,000 gods of Hatti present, fed, and favorably disposed toward the empire that shelters beneath their gaze. The pantheon is vast beyond modern comprehension. Cuneiform tablets recovered from the archives of Hattusa attest to more than 600 individual deities, a number so staggering that the Hittites themselves referred to their divine assembly simply as the 1,000 gods of Hatti. This was not metaphor. It was administrative reality. Every conquered city, every absorbed population, every vassal kingdom brought its own gods into the imperial fold, and the Hittites refused none of them. Where other civilizations might suppress foreign worship, Hittite theology operated on a principle of radical inclusion. The more gods bound to the empire through ritual obligation, the stronger the empire became. At the summit of this divine hierarchy stands the sun goddess of Arina, the supreme deity of the Hittite state, protector of kingship and sovereignty. Her origins reach back to the pre-Indo-European Hattic substrate, where she was venerated under the name Wurusemu. Beside her reigns the storm god, known as Tarhunta in Luwian tradition, and Teshub in the Hurrian theology, that profoundly reshaped Hittite religion from the 15th century before the Common Era onward. Together they form the divine couple whose favor sustains the land, she governing cosmic order and royal legitimacy, he commanding rain, thunder, and the fertility of the earth. The king and queen serve as chief priest and priestess of this cosmic system. Royal obligation to the gods is not ceremonial decoration, but the fundamental duty of sovereignty. Festival calendars dictate the king's movements across the realm for much of the year. The Antashum Spring Festival spans 38 days, requiring the king to visit multiple cult centers, perform libations, break bread before sacred images, and oversee animal sacrifices of bulls and sheep whose entrails are read for divine messages. The Nuntariyasha's festival in autumn mirrors this cycle, binding the harvest to sacred thanksgiving. The Kilam festival merges economic and religious functions, with marketplace activities conducted under divine supervision, prices and trade regulated as acts of piety. Ritual processions wind through the upper city's temple district, where 31 temples stand in close proximity, each housing the cult image of a different deity or divine pair. Priests carry golden ritter shaped as bulls and stags, pouring wine and blood offerings before stone cult pedestals. The sacred spring at Eflatun Pina, near modern Bayzehir, preserves a monumental stone-carved relief depicting the sun goddess flanked by mountain gods and hybrid divine figures, the entire composition rising from a pool fed by natural springs, water itself understood as a medium of divine presence. Hurrian influence transforms the pantheon most dramatically during the 14th and 13th centuries, before the Common Era. The goddess Hepat merges with the sun goddess of Arinna. The Hurrian myth cycles, including the Song of Kumarbi describing divine succession through violence among the gods, enter Hittite literary tradition and bear remarkable parallels to later Greek theogonic narratives. Shaushka, the Hurrian goddess of love and war, gains prominent cult status. Mesopotamian deities too find places, Ea, Anu, Ishtar, absorbed into a theological framework that treats divine multiplicity as strength rather than contradiction. The instructions for temple officials, preserved on cuneiform tablets, reveal the meticulous standards governing sacred service. Priests must be ritually pure. Temple kitchens must maintain strict hygiene. Sacred bread must be baked according to precise formulae. Any contamination of offerings risks divine anger, and divine anger manifests as plague, drought, and military defeat. The plague prayers of Muwatalli II demonstrate this theology in its most desperate form, a king searching temple archives for forgotten ritual obligations that might explain why the gods have turned their faces from Hatti. This is religion as statecraft, theology as infrastructure. Every festival, every sacrifice, every carved relief at Yazilikaya functions within an integrated system designed to maintain cosmic equilibrium. The 1,000 gods are not merely worshipped, they are fed, housed, clothed, and diplomatically managed, much as vassal kings are managed, through obligation, reciprocity, and the constant anxious labor of keeping the sacred contracts intact. The sacred contracts extend beyond the realm of gods. They are written down, pressed into wet clay with the wedge-shaped tip of a reed stylus, and stored in rooms whose contents would remain hidden for more than 3,000 years. The citadel of Buyukale rises above the lower city of Hattusa on a rocky promontory, its walls enclosing the administrative heart of the empire. Within its chambers, arranged on wooden shelving long since rotted away, clay tablets accumulate across centuries. Correspondence, treaties, ritual instructions, oracle queries, land grants, legal judgments, mythological narratives, and detailed instructions for every category of state official. More than 30,000 fragments have been recovered from this single complex, and the full original archive was certainly larger still. This is one of the ancient world's great libraries, not assembled for prestige, but generated by the daily machinery of imperial governance. The language pressed into most of these tablets is Hittite itself, written in the cuneiform script borrowed centuries earlier from Mesopotamian tradition through the Assyrian merchant colonies at Kadesh. But Hittite is only one voice in a multilingual chorus. Diplomatic correspondence with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria is conducted in Akkadian, the lingua franca of Bronze Age statecraft. Religious rituals preserve passages in Hattic, the older language of the indigenous population, treated with reverence as a sacred tongue even after no one speaks it natively. Hurrian appears in prayers, myths, and ritual texts absorbed from the southeast. Luwian, closely related to Hittite, and spoken widely across western and southern Anatolia, surfaces in both cuneiform and a separate hieroglyphic script carved on seals and monumental stone inscriptions. Scribes trained in this system master not merely writing, but translation, moving fluidly between linguistic worlds. The legal corpus stands among the most remarkable products of this bureaucracy. The Hittite law code, preserved in copies spanning the Old Kingdom through the imperial period, contains roughly 200 provisions governing property, assault, theft, marriage, land tenure, and sexual offenses. Its distinguishing feature is a consistent preference for compensation over corporal punishment. Where Mesopotamian codes prescribe mutilation or death, Hittite law frequently demands payment in silver or goods. A broken bone requires a fine. Theft demands restitution at multiples of the stolen value. Later revisions of the code explicitly reduce earlier penalties, and scribes note these changes, recording that where once a certain offense cost a specific amount, now it costs less. The law evolves on the page, self-consciously. Equally revealing are the instructions texts, detailed manuals governing the conduct of temple personnel, border garrison commanders, royal bodyguards, and provincial governors. Temple officials receive exhaustive warnings about ritual purity. Garrison commanders are told precisely how to maintain fortifications, rotate guards, and secure water supplies. These are not aspirational documents. They carry the weight of royal authority and specify punishments for failure. The scribal tools themselves are modest: a cut reed, a lump of prepared clay, a flat surface for writing. Finished tablets are dried or sometimes baked for permanence. Seal impressions authenticate documents, pressing the carved image of a royal or official seal into the clay while it remains soft. The royal seals carry bilingual inscriptions in cuneiform and Luwian hieroglyphs, a deliberate assertion of authority across linguistic boundaries. When Bedřich Hrozny published his decipherment of Hittite cuneiform in 1915, he demonstrated that the language belonged to the Indo-European family, related at its deepest roots to Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and English. The proof hinged partly on a single sentence about bread and water, whose vocabulary echoed patterns recognizable across these distant cousins. That discovery transformed the understanding of language migration and confirmed that the Hittite archives were not merely administrative records, but the earliest extensive writings in any Indo-European tongues. Every tablet pulled from the ruins of Muwatalli carries within it the grammar of a language family that would eventually span continents. The language preserved in those tablets extends far beyond prayer and law. It records the technologies that make empire possible: the casting of bronze, the forging of iron, the engineering of war machines designed to project power across 1,000 kilometers of contested terrain. In the workshops clustered along the lower city of Hattusa, smiths labor over crucibles of molten bronze, an alloy of copper drawn from Anatolian mines, and tin imported along trade routes stretching to Afghanistan. The process is ancient by the 13th century before the Common Era, refined over generations. Molten metal flows into stone and clay molds shaped as swords, spearheads, and axe blades. The finished weapons are hammered, annealed, and sharpened on grinding stones until the cutting edge can split leather armor. Bronze remains the backbone of Hittite armament throughout the empire's existence, reliable and well understood. but something rarer emerges from certain forges. Iron, smelted at temperatures requiring specialized furnaces, and charcoal in quantities that strain local forests, appears in Hittite contexts earlier than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. The metal is not yet steel, it is wrought iron, softer than good bronze in many applications, yet prestigious beyond measure. A letter preserved in the archives, likely addressed to an Ahiawan king, references iron as a commodity so scarce that even royal requests cannot always be fulfilled immediately. The Hittite court controls its distribution with deliberate care, sending iron objects as diplomatic gifts that signal favor and alliance. Iron daggers and ornamental blades circulate among elites from Egypt to Mesopotamia, their value exceeding that of gold by weight. The military machine consuming these metals is built around the chariot. Where Egyptian chariots carry 2 men, a driver and an archer, the Hittite design seats 3. A driver who manages the paired horses, a shield-bearer who protects the crew, and a lancer armed with a thrusting spear. This configuration sacrifices the speed and maneuverability of lighter Egyptian vehicles for shock power. The heavier Hittite chariot, with its 6-spoked wheels, leather-wrapped cab, and reinforced axle set at the midpoint of the carriage rather than the rear, is designed to crash into enemy formations and shatter them. At Kadesh, this design philosophy proved devastating against the unprepared Egyptian divisions caught on the march. Beyond the chariot, Hittite military engineering shapes the landscape itself. The fortifications of Hattusa represent some of the most sophisticated defensive architecture of the Late Bronze Age. The walls of the upper city rise in a double circuit of cyclopean masonry, with towers projecting at regular intervals to create overlapping fields of fire. At the southern rampart near Yerkapa, a massive glacis of packed earth rises to a height that dwarfs approaching forces. Beneath this artificial slope runs a corbelled postern tunnel stretching 71 meters through the embankment, emerging outside the walls. This passage allows defenders to launch surprise sorties against besieging forces, striking from an unexpected direction before retreating through the narrow corridor that no large enemy force can follow. The gate complexes are equally formidable. The Lion Gate and the King's Gate frame their entrances with monolithic carved figures, not merely decorative but structural, their massive stone blocks narrowing the passage to a width that negates numerical superiority. Any attacker funneling through these gates faces defenders positioned on elevated flanking walls. Siege warfare in Hittite practice involves systematic approaches. Texts describe the encirclement of fortified cities, the cutting of water supplies, the use of battering rams against mud brick walls, and the patient reduction of strongholds through blockade. The Hittite army on campaign is a composite force drawing contingents from vassal states across Anatolia and northern Syria, organized under regional commanders who answer to the great king. Supply logistics, recorded in administrative tablets, detail the provisioning of troops with grain, bread, beer, and livestock driven alongside marching columns. The integration of metallurgy, engineering, and organized manpower creates a military system capable of projecting force from the Aegean coast to the Euphrates. Every bronze blade, every iron gift, every stone block in the fortification walls represents a network of extraction, production, and distribution managed from the administrative heart of Hattusa, a system whose complexity rivals anything in the contemporary ancient world, and whose collapse, when it comes, will leave a silence across the plateau that lasts for centuries. Beyond the fortress walls and temple precincts, beyond the bronze foundries and chariot workshops, the vast majority of the empire's population lives in a world measured not by conquest, but by seasons. The Anatolian plateau stretches in every direction, a landscape of rolling steppe broken by river valleys where barley and emmer wheat grow in terraced fields carved into hillsides. Stone-founded villages cluster along watercourses, their mud-brick walls rising a single story above packed earth floors, roofs of timber and thatch darkened by cooking smoke. This is the empire's true foundation, not the diplomacy of kings, but the labor of farmers, herders, potters, and weavers whose surplus feeds the armies and fills the temple storerooms. Hittite land grant documents, preserved on clay tablets, reveal a system in which the great king owns all territory and distributes it to individuals and institutions in exchange for service obligations known as ilku. A landholder might owe military service, labor on royal construction projects, or contributions of grain and livestock. The obligation passes with the land itself, binding successive holders to the same duties. Free landholders occupy a tier above dependent laborers and slaves, yet even slaves possess legal protections codified in the Hittite law collections: the right to marry, to own limited property, to eventually purchase freedom through accumulated payment. Agriculture on the Central Plateau is a gamble against altitude and aridity. Fields at elevations exceeding 1,000 meters endure late frosts and short growing seasons. Barley, hardier than wheat, dominates the upland plots. Emmer wheat thrives in lower valleys, where irrigation channels divert river water across alluvial soils. Vineyard management texts describe the careful tending of grapevines, the pruning schedules, the penalties for neglecting assigned plots. Grain harvested in late summer fills massive storage silos, circular stone-lined pits sunk into the ground, sealed against moisture and vermin, capable of holding reserves sufficient to sustain communities through the long Anatolian winter. The red burnished pottery that distinguishes Hittite material culture emerges from workshops scattered across provincial towns. Potters shape vessels by hand and on slow wheels, burnishing the surface with smooth stones before firing to produce a distinctive lustrous finish in shades of deep red and brown. Storage jars, cooking pots, libation vessels, and ritual rita flow from these workshops into households and temples alike. Loom weights of baked clay, found in dense clusters within domestic structures, testify to textile production as a household industry. Women spin wool from the empire's vast sheep flocks into thread, then weave it on vertical warp-weighted looms into the fabrics that clothe both commoners and courtiers. Hittite family law grants women a legal standing remarkable for the ancient Near East. A woman may own property, initiate divorce under certain conditions, and inherit land. Marriage contracts specify bride prices paid by the groom's family, but also outline the wife's rights to her dowry and household goods. The law codes distinguish carefully between free persons and slaves, between intentional harm and accident, and impose restitution rather than the retributive punishments common in Mesopotamian legal traditions. A man who breaks another's arm pays 20 shekels of silver. A man who kills another's slave replaces the slave, or pays the assessed value. The emphasis falls consistently on restoring balance rather than inflicting equivalent suffering. Merchants move along routes connecting the plateau to the Mediterranean coast, the Euphrates Valley, and the Aegean littoral. They carry textiles, metals, and agricultural products outward, returning with luxury goods, ivory, lapis lazuli, fine oils, destined for palace and temple consumption. The ordinary Hittite, however, lives within a more circumscribed world of village markets and seasonal festivals, where the rhythms of planting and harvest, shearing and weaving, birth and burial define the boundaries of existence. These lives leave few monumental traces. They survive instead in the administrative tablets that record their obligations, in the law codes that protect their rights, in the grain silos and pottery sherds and loom weights that archaeologists recover from the soil of central Anatolia. The quiet material evidence of the millions who sustained an empire without ever inscribing their names in stone. The grain fails. Across the Anatolian plateau, the fields that have sustained the empire for centuries yield less with each passing harvest. The rains that once fell reliably in spring grow erratic, then scarce. Terraced hillsides that produced barley and emmer wheat turn dry and pale under a sun that seems to burn longer and hotter than the oldest farmers can remember. The grain silos of Hattusili, those massive stone-lined pits that once held surplus enough to feed the capital through the harshest winter, begin to empty faster than they can be replenished. The crisis is not confined to Hatti. Across the eastern Mediterranean, a systemic drought tightens its grip on civilizations that have flourished for centuries in an interconnected web of trade and mutual dependence. Tree ring data and pollen cores recovered from lake sediments across Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant confirm what the cuneiform record makes vivid: a prolonged period of aridification beginning around 1230 years before the Common Era that destabilizes agriculture from the Nile Delta to the Euphrates. Suppiluliuma IV, reigning from Hattusili during these desperate decades, confronts an empire fraying at every edge. The Kaska peoples press relentlessly from the north, as they have for generations, but now the resources to repel them grow thin. To the south and east, vassal kingdoms that once sent tribute and troops begin to waver in their loyalty, sensing the weakening of the center. Suppiluliuma responds with both diplomacy and force. He imposes a remarkable trade embargo against Assyria, forbidding merchants from his vassal states, including the critical port of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, from conducting commerce with Assyrian traders. The embargo is an attempt to strangle a rising rival, but it also disrupts the very trade networks that keep grain and essential goods flowing through the empire. Letters recovered from the archives of Ugarit reveal the desperation of these final decades. The king of Ugarit writes to the king of Alasya, Cyprus, pleading for grain shipments. Egypt, itself straining under the pressures of the age, sends emergency grain to Hatti by sea, a remarkable reversal for two powers that had faced each other as enemies at Kadesh barely 2 generations earlier. The correspondence is urgent, clipped, stripped of the elaborate courtesies that once characterized great power diplomacy. And then there are the Sea Peoples. They appear in Egyptian records as a coalition of maritime raiders, groups bearing names like the Peleset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, whose origins remain debated, but whose destructive impact is unmistakable. They move by ship and by land along the eastern Mediterranean coast, burning cities and overwhelming local defenses. Ugarit falls to them around 1190 years before the Common Era, its last letter never sent, found still in the kiln where it was being fired. Suppiluliuma II, the last known king of the Hittite Empire, fights back with extraordinary tenacity. A carved inscription in the Sudberg chamber at Hattusili records his naval victory off the coast of Cyprus, where Hittite ships engage and defeat enemy vessels in what may be the earliest recorded naval battle in Anatolian history. The relief depicts the king in triumph, the imagery projecting confidence and divine favor. But the victory is isolated. It cannot reverse the cascading failures, the drought, the severed trade routes, the loss of vassal territories, the relentless pressure of migrating peoples on every frontier. The walls of Hattusili grow thicker. New fortifications rise along the southern ramparts. The postern tunnel beneath Yerkapur remains operational, a military passage through the bedrock for sorties and supply. The city's defenses are formidable, engineered over centuries to withstand siege. But no wall can hold against famine, against the collapse of the systems that feed and arm the soldiers who man those walls. The granaries empty. The bronze supply dwindles as tin shipments from the east cease. The 1,000 gods of Hatti receive their offerings in temples that grow quieter with each passing season, their festival calendars perhaps curtailed, their priesthoods diminished. The empire that challenged Egypt, that destroyed Mitanni, that forged the world's first peace treaty, enters its final years not with a single catastrophic blow, but with the slow, grinding erosion of every system that once made it great. Sometime around 1180 before the Common Era, the great capital dies. The end comes not as a single moment, but as a sequence of deliberate, methodical acts that leave an archaeological signature unlike any ordinary sacking. Hattusili burns, but it burns strangely. The destruction layers excavated at Boğazkale reveal intense conflagration. Charred timber beams collapse into rooms. Mud brick walls, superheated by sustained fire, vitrify into hardened masses of orange and black. The roofing of the great temple crashes inward, burying the storage magazines beneath tons of scorched debris. Across the upper city, temple after temple shows the same pattern. Systematic burning that reduces centuries of sacred architecture to rubble. The Lion Gate stands open. The Sphinx Gate at Yerkapur stands open. No barricades block the entrances. No heaps of defenders' bodies lie in the gateways. The postern tunnel beneath the rampart remains unblocked, its corbelled stones intact beneath the destruction. What the fire consumes is telling, but what it does not consume is more telling still. The archive rooms of Muwatalli, the citadel where tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets once filled wooden shelving, yield fragments, but not the complete administrative records one would expect of a functioning capital. The most important diplomatic correspondence, the treaty tablets, the royal seal collections, these are largely absent. The gold ritual vessels attested in inventory texts are gone. The cult statues that once inhabited the inner sanctuaries of the temples have vanished. Bronze weaponry, stockpiled in armories for generations, is missing in quantities that cannot be explained by looting alone. Someone removed these things before the fires were set. This absence reshapes the entire understanding of the catastrophe. A city sacked by invaders yields scattered valuables, dropped in flight, trampled in doorways. A city stripped methodically yields emptiness. The evidence suggests that the Hittite court, or what remained of it, organized an evacuation. the population departed, carrying what could be carried, the sacred images, the dynastic records, the precious metals, the weapons. And then, perhaps, the city was put to the torch deliberately, denied to whatever enemy approached, rendered useless as a prize. The identity of that enemy remains uncertain. The Kaska peoples, who had harassed the northern frontier for centuries, may have finally overwhelmed the depleted garrisons. The Sea peoples, whose destructive path carved through Ugarit and the Levantine coast in this same generation, may have reached inland Anatolia. Internal factions, rival claimants to a throne no longer worth holding, may have turned on each other in the empire's final convulsions. The archaeological record preserves the fire, but not the hand that lit it. Hattusa is not alone. Ugarit on the Syrian coast burns in this same narrow window of decades. Mycenae's palatial centers collapse. The Egyptian empire retreats behind its borders. The entire interconnected system of late Bronze Age civilization, the trade networks carrying tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, grain from the Nile Delta, textiles from Mesopotamia, fractures beyond repair. The world that made Hattusa possible simply ceases to exist. Snow settles on the ruins. The Anatolian plateau reclaims its own. Grasses push through cracked foundation stones. Wild animals shelter in the roofless magazines of the great temple. The carved lions at the southwestern gate stare outward with the same fierce vigilance they maintained when armies marched beneath them, but now they guard nothing. The rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya, its 63 carved deities processing eternally along the limestone walls, receives no more pilgrims. Rain slowly erodes the divine faces. The cuneiform tradition that recorded laws, prayers, treaties, and festival calendars for 5 centuries falls silent in central Anatolia. No new tablets are pressed, no new seals are cut. The scribal schools that trained generations in the wedge-shaped script produce no more graduates. The language of Hattusa retreats into the memories of those who fled, carried southward and eastward to places where fragments of Hittite civilization will endure in altered form. The capital itself becomes a ruin, then a memory, then a legend, then nothing at all. A wind-swept plateau of broken stone where shepherds graze their flocks among walls whose builders have been utterly forgotten. But the shepherds grazing their flocks among the broken stones of Hattusa do not represent the end of the story. 500 kilometers to the southeast, across the Taurus Mountains and down into the fertile plains where the Euphrates bends through northern Syria, the memory of Hatti endures in living stone and spoken word. The empire has shattered, but its fragments remain sharp. At Carchemish, perched on the western bank of the Euphrates at a critical river crossing, a dynasty claiming direct descent from the Hittite royal house continues to rule. Kusi-Teshub, a grandson or great-grandson of Suppiluliuma II, governs from a citadel that still bears the architectural grammar of imperial Hatti, massive basalt orthostats carved with processions of warriors, winged sphinxes, and rampant lions flanking ceremonial gateways. The name Teshub, the storm god, persists in royal titles. The religious calendar preserves festivals whose origins stretch back centuries to the temples of the upper city. But the script has changed. Where the scribes of Hattusa pressed cuneiform into clay, the artisans of Carchemish carve Luwian hieroglyphs into stone, a pictographic writing system that had served as a secondary script during the empire and now becomes the primary vehicle of royal expression. These Neo-Hittite kingdoms form an archipelago of city-states scattered across southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria. Malatya commands the upper Euphrates, its gate lions carved from dark basalt, with a severity that echoes imperial tradition. Tabal spreads across the central Anatolian plateau, south of the old heartland. Quo occupies the fertile Cilician plain. Kumu, Gurgum, Samal, each maintains its own dynasty, its own local traditions, yet all share recognizable elements of Hittite cultural inheritance. The storm god still reigns supreme. Royal inscriptions still invoke divine sanction for kingship. The Lion Gate motif, born at Hattusa, replicates itself across a dozen citadels. The long wall of sculpture at Carchemish stretches along the base of the citadel's ceremonial approach, its basalt slabs carved with soldiers in procession, chariots in motion, and mythological scenes rendered in a style that blends Hittite formality with newer Aramaean and Assyrian influences. These reliefs mark the cultural evolution underway. Aramaean peoples, Semitic-speaking migrants who have filled the power vacuum left by the Bronze Age collapse, intermarry with Neo-Hittite dynasties and introduce their language and customs. Bilingual inscriptions appear, Luwian hieroglyphs alongside Phoenician alphabetic script, testifying to a world where Hittite heritage negotiates with new realities. For nearly 5 centuries, these kingdoms maintain their independence, trading with Phoenician coastal cities, warring among themselves, and navigating the growing shadow of Assyria to the east. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, ascending to unprecedented power under Ashur-nasirpal II and Shalmaneser III in the 9th century before the Common Era, begins extracting tribute from the Neo-Hittite states. Assyrian palace reliefs depict the submission of Hittite kings, their tribute of silver, horses, and carved ivory carried before the Assyrian throne. The end comes gradually, then all at once. One by one, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms lose their autonomy. Some are annexed outright. Others become vassal states stripped of meaningful sovereignty. In 717 before the Common Era, Sargon II of Assyria conquers Carchemish itself, deporting its ruling family and incorporating the ancient city into the Assyrian provincial system. The last kingdom bearing the cultural imprint of Hatti ceases to exist as an independent entity. Yet even in absorption, the legacy persists. Assyrian scribes refer to all of Syria and southeastern Anatolia as the land of Hatti, a geographic designation that outlives the political reality by centuries. The artistic traditions of Neo-Hittite stone carving influence Assyrian and later Persian monumental art. The religious syncretism that characterized Hittite civilization continues to shape Anatolian spiritual life, its echoes detectable in Phrygian, Lydian, and eventually Greek religious practices. The storm god of Hatti lives on in new names and new temples, his thunderbolt passing from hand to divine hand across the centuries. For nearly 3,000 years, the thunderbolt passes unseen. The name of Hatti fades from living memory, surviving only as a ghostly geographic label in Assyrian and Babylonian records, then disappearing even from those. By the classical age, neither Herodotus nor Thucydides speaks of a great Anatolian empire that once rivaled Egypt. The plateau keeps its silence. Wind scours the exposed foundations. Shepherds build their stone shelters against walls whose builders no one remembers. Then, in 1834, a French architect and explorer named Charles Texier rides into the remote Turkish village of Boğazkale, searching for a Roman site. What he finds instead defies every framework he possesses. Massive cyclopean walls stretch across ridge lines. A gateway flanked by carved lions stares outward with an authority that belongs to no Roman or Greek tradition he recognizes. Texia sketches the ruins, publishes his findings, and the scholarly world begins a slow, bewildered reckoning with something entirely unexpected. A monumental civilization hiding in plain sight. The puzzle deepens over the following decades. Scattered across Anatolia and northern Syria, travelers document carved stone blocks bearing an unknown hieroglyphic script. In 1876, the Irish-born Assyriologist Archibald Henry Sayce proposes a radical hypothesis. These dispersed monuments belong to a single, vast empire, the Hittites mentioned fleetingly in the Hebrew Bible. The academic world is skeptical. No empire of such scale could have vanished so completely. The proof arrives in 1906. The German archaeologist Hugo Winkler begins systematic excavation at Boghaz-Calais and unearths an astonishing archive. Over 10,000 cuneiform tablets buried in the ruins of the citadel. Among them sits the Akkadian language version of the peace treaty between Hatti and Egypt, the very document whose Egyptian counterpart adorns the walls of the Temple of Karnak. In a single season, an entire civilization resurfaces from the earth. Yet the tablets cannot be fully read. The language they contain is unknown. It falls to a Czech linguist, Bedřich Hrozny, working in Vienna during the upheaval of the First World War, to achieve the breakthrough. In 1915, Hrozny demonstrates that the Hittite language is Indo-European, related, however distantly, to Latin, Greek, and English. A single sentence from an ancient text about bread and water unlocks a linguistic door sealed for millennia. The implications reshape the entire understanding of Indo-European migration and the ancient Near East. Excavations continue throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. The German Archaeological Institute maintains ongoing work at Boghaz-Calais, revealing new tablets, refining the city plan, uncovering the full extent of the upper city's 31 temples. The rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya yields its secrets slowly, its carved procession of 63 deities now understood as a cosmic calendar, its hidden inner chamber recognized as a memorial for King Tudhaliya IV. Each season brings new fragments, new connections. In Ankara, the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations gathers the material legacy into a single, breathtaking collection. Gold vessels from Alaka Hoyuk gleam beside basalt lions from Carchemish. Cuneiform tablets rest in climate-controlled cases, their wedge-shaped impressions still sharp after 33 centuries. And in the headquarters of the United Nations in New York, a replica of the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty hangs on the wall, a reminder that the oldest known international peace agreement was forged not by modern diplomats, but by Bronze Age kings who understood that coexistence could outlast conquest. In 1986, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization designates Hattusa a World Heritage Site, formally recognizing the capital of a civilization that the modern world had forgotten for 3 millennia. The plateau that kept its silence for so long now speaks again, through stone, through clay, through the patient labor of those who dig and decipher. The Hittites endure, not as a living empire, but as proof that even the most powerful civilizations can vanish from memory and be reborn through the persistence of their own craftsmanship, the durability of their own words pressed into clay, and the curiosity of those who refuse to let the past remain buried. Thank you for journeying through the complete story of this extraordinary civilization. If this series has deepened your understanding of the ancient world, consider subscribing so you never miss the next journey into history.